And our next speaker is J.Reid from NTNU. She will talk about integrating ecological, demographic, and genetic constraints on red-billed chough conservation.
Okay, thank you. Well done for almost pronouncing chough right. So I'm going to indeed integrate these three components. And I think this talk has been very nicely set up by the previous ones, where Robin started with his pie chart of how conservation genetics fitted into the holistic view of conservation biology and said, well, we need to know how big that part of the pie is. And then, of course, the other angle is that once we've understood NE, we need to actually translate it into conservation action, which perhaps we haven't also quite talked about today. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is illustrate how we can estimate and use NE in the context of the wider ecological and demographic and conservation challenges for a focal population, and then how we can try to translate that knowledge into effective conservation policy, which is actually what we're trying to do. And I come at this from the perspective of really being a population and evolutionary ecologist. So I see population viability as fundamentally a demographic problem, where in the simple case of an isolated population, the births aren't enough to balance out the deaths. And then those processes of births and deaths are fundamentally influenced by a combination of ecological and environmental constraints on one hand and genetic constraints on the other. Then we need to remember that there are some important feedbacks that can arise in this kind of system where the environmental constraints on demography can decrease population size, which then alters the genetic constraints. And that is exactly the sweet spot where the effective population size fits in. So maybe the reason why Google and everybody else is flagging up NE as the most important part of this process is because it provides the interface between the genetic and demographic impacts on population viability. So having set up this framework, then there's some important things we need to know as population and conservation managers. What are the primary constraints in this system? How can we reduce them? And so how can we use this kind of advanced scientific understanding to actually inform efficient and effective conservation policy, which is what we want to do. So I'm going to try to explain how we've been trying to do this using a system of red-billed choughs that lives on the west coast of Scotland. And this is kind of a side project for me, really, but I think it's an important and interesting one, so it's nice to get a chance to present it here today. And the reason why these birds are of interest in this context is that they have a very fragmented remnant distribution that runs down the west coast of the British Isles and Ireland. So these red points are the currently remaining populations, and these two black ones are ones that have gone extinct within the last 20 or so years. And because of this fragmented distribution, red-billed chough is listed on Annex 1 of the EU Wild Birds Directive, which at least at the moment does still apply in the UK, even following Brexit. And what that means is that the government agencies in these countries are legally responsible to try to maintain these populations on their territory. And in Scotland, that means that our government agency, Nature Scot, which is, I think, more or less the equivalent of the Milieudirectorate, is responsible for protecting the two remaining populations, which are on the islands of Colonsay and Islay in the Southern Hebrides. And any whiskey lovers in the audience will no doubt be familiar at least with Islay. It's a nice place to do fieldwork. And the problem here is that both of these populations have been decreasing over the last 40 or so years. So the population on Islay has decreased from nearly 80 breeding pairs down to only around 40 over these 30 or so years. And it's stabilized a bit subsequently, and I'll come back to the reason for that later. Meanwhile, the population on Colonsay has always been small, and it's recently decreased to only about 3 or 4 pairs. So my job as a scientist with this system that the government conservation agencies are interested in is what is causing these declines, what combination of ecology, genetics, and resulting demography, what are the implications of those declines, so the feedback on the genetics, what can we do about it, and so what should the priorities be? And to answer those questions, I first just need to tell you a little bit about the ecology of the system. So these choughs are really restricted to the western seaboard because they're birds of very low intensity pastoral agricultural habitats like these. So these photos were taken on Islay, but they could as well have been in parts of western Norway like Helgeland or Orkney. And then in Scotland, there's also these lovely dune systems, which are very useful, particularly for the newly fledged choughs. And that's because they're rich resources of these kinds of invertebrates in these grasslands, which is basically what these birds are eating for most of the year. Traditionally, they breed in caves in the sea cliffs like this, but these days they also build a lot in abandoned farm buildings and sometimes in sheds like this that are purpose-built for these birds to breed in. So this is effectively a nest box for a chough, and you can see the pair sitting very happily on the roof. And this system is quite amenable to working on these birds. So we're very lucky that there's been a long-term demographic monitoring project going on both islands since 1983, run by the Scottish Chough Study Group, which is basically a bunch of enthusiastic people. So every year we visit as many of these nest sites as is feasible, where the definition of feasibility can sometimes be quite broad. And the idea is to monitor nest occupancy, record the breeding success, so the number of chicks fledged per breeding pair, colouring as many chicks as possible with these unique combinations of colourings, which mean we can identify the individuals subsequently just by remote sighting, and then identify the breeding adults. And until I messed things up by moving to Norway, my job in this was to go every Easter and walk around the more remote parts of the island and identify the colouring adults that were still alive in the less accessible territories. And overall, this effort has now generated over 130,000 subsequent resightings of these colouring birds. So this is really a tremendously valuable data set, especially for a small population of immediate conservation concern like this. There really probably aren't too many data sets like this for any system in the world. And I think it's important to emphasize here that this has been done with very low intensity effort. There has never been any attempt to completely mark this population. It's just gone by visiting which nest sites are accessible. And it's done with very low degree of invasiveness. The only time the birds are ever handled is once when their chicks are about this age to put the colourings on, and then the adults are never caught subsequently. But despite that, it gives us a lovely data set to try to identify the demographic constraints on population viability. And just to summarize perhaps the key results here, if we look at the variation in breeding success across time, so the number of chicks fledged per breeding pair, you can see that it varies quite substantially among years, but there's no long-term trend. So there's no evidence that breeding success has gone up or down on average over these 40 years. If we look at adult survival, so this is the probability that an adult chough that's alive one spring will still be alive the next spring. Again, there's a bit of variation among years, but no overall change. But then if we look at first year survival probability, so this is the probability that a newly fledged chough will survive to be age 1 the following spring, you can see again there's a lot of variation among years, but also a very obvious decline, where during the first half of the study, or the grand mean is around 0.4, which was enough to maintain a more or less stable population. But now the grand mean is down more like 0.2 or 0.3, which is not. And we don't need to do any particularly clever population modeling to know that that's going to be true. So this is the problem. This is why the population on Isla has been going down. It's basically a problem with post-fledging survival. And that raises the question of what is causing this variation among years and the long-term trend, and what can we do about it? And to do that, I'm going to zoom in on the first half of the study, which is going from 1983 up to 2004. And again, this is the variation among years in juvenile survival. And I can superimpose on that the lovely time series we've got of tipulid abundance in these grassland farms. So across the west of Scotland, there's an agricultural monitoring scheme that measures the density of these bugs, basically so that the farmers know when to spray their fields with nasty stuff in the outbreak years. And what you can see is that the abundance of these invertebrates in the farmland is extremely tightly correlated with this among-year variation in chough first-year survival probability. So this seems like quite compelling evidence, or at least for the hypothesis, that food limitation for these young choughs following fledging is really the major constraint on the viability of this population. So this information went straight into policy to try to improve the invertebrate diversity in some of these key grassland areas. So Nature Scot designated some new special protection areas in these dune grasslands, which is the UK's main tool for protecting land areas for biodiversity purposes. They introduced new agri-environment schemes, so farmers could get paid money to manage their grasslands for chough grazing, basically by fostering the invertebrate communities. And there was reasonably good uptake of these schemes across Islay and Colonsay. So far, so good. Maybe this seems already like a successful science-informed conservation policy. I was quite happy. Of course, it didn't quite work. So these schemes are kind of introduced here, but before they really got going, something very bad happened to first-year survival, and there were 3 cohorts where basically once first-year survival is down here. Given that choughs don't first breed typically until age 3, then this population is not going to last very long. So it raised some quite important and urgent questions about what is causing this. And I think we could postulate quite clearly that this was an ecological problem, not directly a genetic problem. And that's because choughs have a generation time of 7 or 8 years. So it's mostly the same parents that are producing these cohorts of chicks as these ones. And it seems very unlikely that this can be a genetic shift on a kind of within cohort basis. So we postulated that this was the same problem that we'd seen earlier, that basically it was a food shortage following fledging. So then, given that there wasn't time for the agri-environment schemes to really kick in, we introduced an emergency program of supplementary feeding, where basically saying if the choughs are starving, well, let's just feed them. So this is Eric Bignell, who's been one of the leading proponents of this project right from the start. So pretty much every day now since 2010, he's gone along to the subadult roost flock areas before feeding and given them some food, which he puts down here. And the aim with this was not to replace their daily intake, but just to top it up in the evening, so if they're a bit hungry, they got an extra snack. And this has been working extremely well. And my former wonderful PhD student, Sarah Fenn, did some analyses of the colouring reciting data to try to evaluate the efficacy of this intervention. And she showed that the juvenile survival probability across each month from fledging in the fed birds is typically higher than those in the unfed birds, so that across the 4-year, this adds up to a very substantial improvement in survival with the supplementary food. Although this wasn't part of the plan, some of the local adults also came to the food, and we used the classic before-after control intervention analysis to try to evaluate the impacts on the adults too. And we found that in the adults living in the area where the food was provided, their survival during the feeding period was much higher than it had been previously, when there was no change in the adults living in other parts of the island where the food wasn't provided. So this seems like quite compelling evidence that the feeding intervention is having a predicted positive effect on juvenile survival, and also an unexpected effect on adult survival probability that we weren't expecting, because the long-term demographic data had not indicated that there was any constraint on adult survival. But the combination of these two effects has had a quite dramatic positive effect on population growth rate, which is why the population size on Isla has now stabilized, or maybe even started to increase. That can be almost entirely attributed to this intervention. So maybe we could say that this is another successful science-informed conservation measure. It might or might not be what you would see as ideal conservation. This is basically the entire Scottish population of subadult choughs in their juvenile flock, all nicely addicted to mealworms. So, while we've maybe kind of approximately solved the immediate crisis, this picture also shows you the remaining challenge, and also starts to highlight that this is all the juveniles left, then we're going to have other problems coming along very soon, that even if they aren't the main driving force now, probably soon will be. So this is what I'm supposed to be talking about today, the genetic part. And we quite quickly had a view that there may be some already important genetic problems emerging in this population, and that was linked to the occurrence of occasional blindness in the chough chicks. So when the ringers go to the nest sites each year to ring the chicks, there's occasional ones they noticed where their eyes weren't developed properly, so the cornea here is completely opaque, so this chick is completely blind. And of course, that doesn't matter when it's growing up in its nest, which traditionally is in a cave when it's dark anyway, and its parents are stuffing it with food. But then, of course, when it tries to fledge, it's not going to end well. So my wonderful former PhD student, Amanda Trask, got very interested in this, and she worked out that exactly 25% of chicks in the affected families where blindness had ever been seen were ones that were blind. And of course, you'll already have realized that that is exactly what we'd expect if this blindness is caused by a lethal recessive allele that's inherited from both parents. So a classic model like this would be where two parents are heterozygous with an orange allele that gives you a normal eye and a black allele that gives you this opaque phenotype. Then on average, given standard Mendelian segregation, 1 in 4 of those offspring are going to be blind. So this is a very parsimonious explanation for why we see this frequency of this lethal recessive phenotype. So this seems to be evidence of direct death by genetics in a wild population of immediate conservation concern. And while we might quite commonly postulate that that is the case, actually there are still quite few examples of where this has actually been demonstrated in nature. It's a very interesting case study. So this is kind of dramatic and it's not really very helpful for the chough population, but then at the same time, we can maybe start to put this in some kind of a perspective where across the whole population, it's only about 1 or 2% of all chicks that meet this fate. And that, of course, is because most sets of parents aren't both heterozygous for this detrimental allele. So while this is not great, this is clearly an order of magnitude less than the ecological causes of juvenile mortality in the system. So here we could then maybe conclude that ecology is much more important than the genetics in constraining conservation, but then we could also say, well, this blindness might just be the visible tip of the iceberg of this genetic constraint. We can see the blindness that kills these chicks at fledging, but we can't see what else is happening later. So to try to get at the bottom of that, we did some quite basic population genetics, and this was a wonderful piece of work that was actually done by an undergraduate student in Aberdeen, Marius Wenzel. So we had some microsatellite markers which we developed for the Scottish population, which is what we had in circa 2010, and genotyped individuals from all of these remaining populations. And a simple structure analysis basically recreated the populations almost exactly. So these blue sections here correspond to Colonsay and Islay. The purple one is the Isle of Man, the yellow ones are the two ends of Wales, and the red ones are Ireland and Cornwall. And this is quite interesting because the Cornish population was colonized in 2001, and this suggests that those birds came from Ireland. And in all cases, there was very high FST among these populations, particularly between the Scottish ones and the other ones, extremely strong isolation by distance, and very low heterozygosity, which although it's a bit hard to know what that means when you have a number based on some microsatellites, it was, again, much lower in the Scottish populations than elsewhere. So these data really went to support our understanding from colouring in projects in all of these populations that migration among these areas is currently extremely limited and probably zero, and probably has been for at least a few decades. So that raises an obvious question in terms of how quickly is inbreeding going to escalate in these populations in the future. And so if it's not the main constraining factor already, how quickly is it going to become so? So this is where Amanda came in again, and she got very interested in trying to estimate the effective size of the Islay population, and so the rates of accumulation of inbreeding and loss of genetic variation. And then neither she or I had kind of got into this before, but we quickly hit all of the challenges and interesting things about estimating NE in quite a demographically complicated system, where our previous work using the long-term demographic data had already shown us that there would be very high and highly dimensional variation in reproductive success, lots of forms of environmental stochasticity, which you've already seen some of, very strong age structure, and quite considerably overlapping generations. We got a bit stuck here, and then we came across this paper, which seemed like it might be what we needed, especially since it can estimate things using incomplete demographic data, which is what we had for this system. And this is the work by Steiner and Bernteric and others. The snag was that Amanda and I didn't really understand this paper, so I emailed Bernteric to ask if we could come and visit, and he said yes, as long as I was the opponent for Thomas's thesis at the same time, which was a good way of forcing me to learn the background. There being no such thing as a free lunch, apparently. So you've already seen this equation from Thomas, which I'm not going to explain much more. So it gives an estimate of the NE to N ratio as a function of the generation time, and this thing here, which is basically the total demographic variance in the population, which is exactly in the same way that Thomas estimated it. We estimated it from a 2-sex, 3-age structure matrix model using the demographic data from the core period of our study. To cut a long story very short, the answer here turned out to be around 0.2, which was kind of made sense given that we knew that there was very high among individual and among area variation in reproductive success in the population. So given at this point there was roughly 140 known choughs, adult or subadult in the population, that gives us an NE about 30. And then, of course, whatever you think about various benchmarks for what or is not a safe limit, let's say 50. Well, clearly NE is small, right? We don't really need to argue whether the right number should be 50 or 100 or whatever. This is small. And I, before we did these analyses, was quite cynical, actually, about how much more we would learn from them in a conservation context, because my point of view was, well, we already know this population is very small, which is why people are worrying about it. So why is the government going to be more interested because we can give them a different number? So in some senses, Amanda and I were more interested in this because we were interested in understanding the effects of the demographic variance that we'd just been studying on the NE. But actually, I turned out to be completely wrong. And when we presented this number to Nature Scotland, the conservation agencies, they were fixated on it very fast because I think it really managed to communicate to them extremely efficiently that genetic constraints could be a real and increasing threat to chough population persistence in Scotland. So in some ways, having shown to them that we could go through this rigorous process of actually estimating a number, even though they really did not understand what it meant in any detail, they really got hold of it. And it really kind of pushed them thinking that clearly then we're going to need some immigrants into this population. And since the evidence was that the immigrants weren't going to come by themselves, then that implies that we're going to need some translocations. But that in turn then generated a little bit of a conservation challenge. Because the question then is, should we translocate choughs into Islay to restore genetic variation and effectively increase the effective population size? Of course, there's no point in doing that if the habitat isn't going to be good enough to support the choughs. So then, should we invest more in the grassland management or in more supplementary feeding? Then there's no point in doing that if the choughs are just going to be genetically doomed. So it raised some important policy questions on which should be the priority here, or actually do we need to do both, and investing in one without the other is simply going to be a complete waste of resources. So to answer that, Amanda and I built an individual-based population model where we could design it to try to capture the spatial and temporal variation in demography in Islay as much as we could from the demographic data. And to cut a long story quite short, what that model suggested is if we do nothing, so no supplementary feeding, no habitat management, and no translocations, then the likelihood is that the population will go extinct over roughly a 25-year time frame. So here, all of these grey lines is an individual replicate simulation from the individual-based model, and the black line in the middle is the overall mean. So we also need to take these kinds of simulations a little bit with a pinch of salt, but I think the kind of outcome or path of travel is very clear. If we do translocations to alleviate inbreeding, but no supplementary feeding or habitat management, actually the position doesn't really change that much. So in these simulations, we had 2 translocations, I think of 25 individuals each time, 3 years apart, and you can see that it slows down the decrease a bit, but doesn't really alter the direction of travel. If we do supplementary feeding or some kind of equivalent habitat management that has the same demographic effect, but no translocations, then the position is a bit better. There's a lot of variance and uncertainty in the outcome. We still can't guarantee that choughs will be in Scotland that far into the future. So then if we do both of these things, supplementary feeding or equivalent habitat management and some degree of translocation, then things start to look slightly better, and at least we can be a bit more optimistic of having a stable population size. And that's because of the interaction between these ecological and genetic effects, whereby the ecological intervention is preventing the population from decreasing, which prevents the escalation of NE, of drift and inbreeding, which can then be alleviated by the translocations, which then allows the population to take advantage of the fact that the ecology has been improved. So the conclusion from this work really is that we need to be careful to take into account both parts of the equation and its impact on demography and its feedback through NE if we're going to be able to manage population viability. If we'd only done one half of this picture, so only focused on the ecology or only focused on the genetics and inbreeding, we would probably have come up with the wrong answer because actually they're interacting with each other and we need to handle both in order to get the outcome that we need. All right, more patting ourselves on the back of scientists. Yeah, we know the answer. And I guess arguably we do understand the genetic, ecological and genetic constraint almost better than in any other system where these kinds of management interventions are likely to be a proximate concern. So the question then is, can we actually translate this into successful conservation? Because there's not much point in having a lovely understanding of the system if they're still going to go extinct. So this firstly got a little bit derailed by Brexit and COVID, but then after that it caused some debate about whether this was really the right thing to invest in Scotland, or whether we should just leave this population to its fate. And the government consensus seems to be now that there is going to be renewed investment in trying to maintain this species in Scotland. So there's now a new generation of agri-environment schemes, the rural services that's coming under the Scottish Agri-Environment and Climate Scheme, which is the major scheme by which farmers can get public money to manage their land for biodiversity. So choughs, there's two options for chough, the mown grassland, and there's a chough grazing management option also that can be bought into. The challenge we've got now is that this management for biodiversity is slightly coming into a conflict with the second scheme that's being rolled out in Scotland, which is the carbon neutral island scheme. And now Islay is one of 6 demonstration islands in Scotland where they're trying to aim for a target of complete carbon neutrality by 2040. And a big part of this is going to involve destocking, particularly taking cows off the landscape because they cause enormous emissions. So that's not very compatible with a lot of the agri-environment schemes which are trying to pay farmers to increase their cows. So it's not very clear how that one's going to balance out. At the same time, there's a consultancy that was put out to tender in Scotland where the award was made to the Zoological Society of London to do a full feasibility study of population reinforcements for birds on these islands. And I was involved in a big stakeholder meeting for that on Wednesday, where they're using a full structured decision-making process to try to weigh up the pros and cons and the best way of actually introducing some new blood to this population. So that's where we are now. We'll see what happens next. I'd just like to finish by highlighting how this project was actually undertaken, which right from the outset has been through an extremely productive collaboration between university researchers and a set of farmers, chough enthusiasts and researchers at the Scottish Agricultural College who've really mostly collected a lot of this data and provided all of the insight into the agricultural management, which is certainly not my area of expertise. And I've learned a lot from that, and it's been a really nice way of generating this knowledge. That's been done alongside very close interactions with the Scottish Government agency, Nature Scot, and some of you might recognise some of these people because they're also very much involved in other species management that links to Norway, including sea eagles and geese, and then many people from the non-governmental organisation, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. And if you're interested in this story, there's a review of it written here, which basically summarises everything I've just told you up to the point of the latest generation of agri-environment schemes. But then I think the downside of this is we've been working on this for 20 years now. And the upshot is that these birds remaining on Islay are still addicted to mealworms. There's not really any particularly clear prospect that things are going to get much better in terms of that. So then I think it's a little bit sobering that the lovely Scottish landscape apparently does not have enough invertebrate life in it to support 50 or 60 juvenile crows through the summer. That's the challenge. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Jane. Questions?
So this plans to manage them. I'm just curious to know what the process is. You mentioned the stakeholder involvement because, Christine and I both represent the CPSG, and that's what we do as well. So I was wondering in what process you're doing that.
Yeah. So the process for doing that was what was put out to tender by the Scottish Government. So it was done so that it was independent of all of the researchers and stakeholders in the chough system. And the contract was won by John Ewan's group at ZSL, who you might know. So a couple of his postdocs are running the process, and what they've done so far is there's been a round of kind of questionnaire that went to a whole bunch of stakeholders, including basically everybody on this list and any of the other kind of landowners and stakeholders on the island, including some people in the tourist industry who might be relevant. And the first part of that was to basically define the consensus objectives, which unsurprisingly came out as being having a viable population of choughs on the island and these kind of things. But that process was gone through formally. And one nice thing about the choughs, in some senses, is that there's really zero conflict over the ambition to have more choughs in Scotland. So everybody likes these birds. The farmers like them. The tourist industry likes them. The bird watchers like them. The farmers like them. Really, there should be no problem here. So in some ways, if we can't do this one, then we're in trouble with the tougher ones. So the objectives were defined very clearly. And then what we were doing on Wednesday was going through a process of postulating different translocation or reinforcement regimes. So everything from the release site to the source population to the frequency to the age class to introduce, all of that, so that we could come up with a set of consensus plausible routes, which they're then going to go away and model to see how effective they are versus some kind of cost balance, benefit balance. So that's the process. And then I think there'll be another round of stakeholder partitioning after they've done the modeling to get kind of more input on that.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I was wondering, do you think this really, really thorough and good study can give some general recommendations for other conservation management efforts?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think in some ways that's what this paper is about, is trying to make the general case. And I think what's been very effective about this team of people and this system is it's, if you have a kind of an adaptive management paradigm where you kind of understand the problem, try and do something about it, monitor it, feed that back to update this understanding. We've already done a couple of rounds of that. But I think what's been nice about it is it's fed right back to update the kind of fundamental understanding, because I think what all of the papers from this project, apart from the conservation genetics one that was an undergraduate project, have been quite deliberately published in the journals of the British Ecological Society, where the whole thing has been pitched in a broader context that's got nothing to do with the choughs. And actually, there's the papers in this project have been cited well over 1,500 times, and most of that's got nothing to do with chough conservation, right? It's been picked up all over the place in terms of, for example, the forces that can cause demographic variation in this kind of population. So I think we've been reasonably successful in this, which I'm quite proud of actually, is linking the kind of fundamental population and evolutionary ecology development of ideas right through to a conservation policy that's happening on the ground. Whether or not it's successful remains to be seen, but we've been making a big effort to join the dots right through that process.
Yes, super talk. Thank you. Do you have data do you know about the other population from which you would take and could it be anything that is similar to your other project on song sparrow, where you could have outbreeding depression?
Yeah, so what Christoph is alluding to, for those that don't know, is I work on a system of song sparrows in Canada where there's natural immigration, which basically causes migrational meltdown, which basically means that the immigrants are importing genetic effects that are detrimental in the recipient population. So that's part of what we were talking about in this workshop on Wednesday, is we have no idea what's going to happen if we bring in birds from any of these populations into these. We probably won't know until we try. So there was another chunk of this paper that I cut off because actually there's also chough populations in the French Alps and in the Spanish steppes and in parts of Italy that were also included in our genetic analysis, and they are, they really, they're different subspecies basically. They really stand out. So we've ruled out any translocations from those populations, and then I think the difficulty is that these ones fall right in the grey area where it probably will be fine, but.
I just wondered if you've considered starting a breeding program.
Yeah, so that's also on the agenda. So choughs have recently been reintroduced to Jersey in the Channel Islands and also to Kent, which is down here. And those birds have been bred in captivity and originate from the South Wales population. So there is some capacity to do that. And one of the strategies might be to start a breeding program at the Highland Wildlife Park, which is an offshoot of Edinburgh Zoo, which is kind of up here somewhere. So that would be the closest facility. So that's an option. And it may be that if any reinforcement does happen, it might be a bit of a mix and match where it's basically we get some troughs from wherever we can get them from in whatever combination, I would guess.
Thank you so much. That's really cool study. I'm so curious about the blind gene. Do you know what gene?
No, I mean, well, so it's this phenotype is very analogous to a phenotype that is known from captive poultry like turkeys particularly, and it's also analogous to something in humans that's called Peter's anomaly, which is basically a failure of the cornea to develop. And there are some known large effect loci that cause that in humans. So Amanda did have an extremely commendable go at trying to sequence the analogous genes for the one that's, I can't remember what it's called, is it FOX2? Whatever. She tried to clone the gene in the choughs that was analogous to the gene that's causal in humans, but we didn't find any SNPs that were aligned with the phenotype. But you know, it was like a kind of needle in a. We had very limited genomic resources, and so you know, it's something that someone could have a go at again. Basically.
I asked this question is because, for example, this to me is kind of very deteriorating gene, like phenotype in the field.
Yeah.
But they still keep 0.13.
Yeah.
Frequency, which is really high.
Yeah, there's a very interesting part of the story which we didn't have time to explain, is that there is a little bit of evidence for overdominance such that the heterozygous parents tend to breed more successfully than the assumed homozygotes wild type. So basically, although a quarter of the chicks in these families are dying because of the blindness, actually on average, the families that occasionally produce blind chicks produce another chick on average. So actually the number of chicks that fledges is kind of the same. So there is, and we have no idea why that is.
Would it be benefit to have enemy to like a higher selective stress to remove the deterrence gene?
Well, I mean, the reason we were trying to estimate the frequency in the population is to see whether if we could find them a diagnostic marker, we could take it out. Right, but it turned out, you know, and that could be done if it had been a recent mutation, which was then only present in like 1 or 2 families. But actually, the evidence that we found is it's very widely distributed in the population, so it's probably been there for a long time, and actually, it's quite high frequency. So, you know, we can't, you know, this comes back to a population decimation, right? Even if we could diagnose which ones were the carriers, we can't take out 15% of the adults and have anything left, right? So,
thank you.
Thank you, Jane. There's more questions in the chat. I've seen them, but I will pass them on to Jane later on. So thanks again, Jane, for this very nice case study.